Welcome back. It is time now for the France 24 debate. Today we're examining the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh, an enclave in Azerbaijan, which until 2 weeks ago had a sizable ethnic Armenian population. Now it's empty. More than 100,000 of its former residents have crossed the border and now live in Armenia. Well, the French foreign minister has today been visiting Armenia. She's the first Western minister to visit since the Azeri operation. And she's there to reaffirm France's support to Armenia's sovereignty and territorial integrity. She's also assessing Armenia's needs as it faces this huge influx of refugees and the threat, some fear, of Azerbaijani military operations on its territory. Well, that fear is compounded by the sense that France and the West more generally didn't take a strong position on Nagorno-Karabakh, which could serve to embolden the Azeris should they decide to venture beyond their borders. So what is the purpose of this visit to Armenia by the French foreign minister? Can France offer Armenia any kind of security guarantees? Could the EU be poised to step in and sanction Baku? And what will become of the more than 100,000 ethnic Armenians who've been forced to flee? Those are some of the questions I'll be putting to our guests today. I'm joined here in the studio by Laurent Lelekien, who is a political analyst and South Caucasus and Asia Minor specialist. A very warm welcome to you, Laurent.
Good evening.
Live from Baku, I'm joined by Kavus Abushov, who is an associate professor of political science at Ada University, which specializes in foreign affairs. Live from Yerevan, we're joined by Richard Giragosyan, who is director of the independent think tank, the Regional Studies Centre. And from the southern Armenian town of Goris, which is about 10 kilometres from Azerbaijan, we're joined by France 24 senior reporter Catherine Norris-Trent. Let's start by taking a look at the situation in Stepanakert, which is the largest city in Nagorno-Karabakh. It's a city that's now empty.
Escorted by the Azerbaijani military, a convoy of journalists enters Stepanakert, a city that just 2 weeks ago was home to 55,000 people. Now, on the streets, battered by a months-long blockade and decades of separatist struggle, there are few signs of anything new, other than a signpost that bears the name Khankendi, the Azerbaijani name of the city, also the name that the UN mission used after its visit to the town on Sunday.
Travelling from Akhdam, the mission visited the city of Khankendi. The mission was struck by the sudden manner in which the local population left their homes and the suffering the experience must have caused.
This satellite image was taken above Stepanakert in November 2021 and here from the same position last Friday. On the ground, journalists encountered nobody other than a stray dog. Outside the city, on a road leading to Armenia, a camera crew finally met an Armenian from Nagorno-Karabakh.
Why should I stay here, all alone? My whole family is already in Armenia.
Azerbaijan says it has put in place an administration tasked with reintegrating the Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians into Azerbaijani society. But the locals are wary, and throughout this region, they have all fled.
Well, let's cross now to France 24 senior correspondent Catherine Norris-Trent. Catherine, I'd like to start by taking a look at the situation in Nagorno-Karabakh. You are obviously in Goris, though. Just tell us what the significance is of where you are right now.
Good evening. Well, Goris is a town which is just a few dozen kilometers away from the border with Nagorno-Karabakh, and it's through this mountainous town that exodus of more than 100 1,000 ethnic Armenians poured in recent days. So it has been overwhelmed with people arriving with whatever worldly belongings they could gather strapped to the roofs of their vehicles. And it was a major humanitarian hub. People getting more dispersed throughout Armenia now, looking for somewhere to rebuild their lives. But Goris is a town which has seen waves of refugees, of people heading here when there has been conflict in the past. In 2020, a lot of people came here seeking shelter while that war raged on. But now it has seen the end of an era, for the moment at least, as that exodus has seen the Karabakh Armenians pouring out of Nagorno-Karabakh.
And just before we spoke to you, we were looking at the French Foreign Minister Catherine Colonna on a visit to Yerevan. It's the first visit to the country by a senior Western minister since this situation erupted. What's the point of her visit, Catherine?
Well, she announced some more aid. It was also a symbolic show of support, and she didn't give many details, but hinted at military equipment that could be given to Armenia by France under future contracts. But this was also about France saying that they would be defending Armenia if Armenian fears about threats to its territorial integrity were realised. So it was a message, a very public message of support for Armenia on Catherine Colonna's visit today.
And of course, where you are, you're meeting a lot of people who've just left Nagorno-Karabakh. A lot of them are there in Goris. What are they telling you about why they decided to leave the place they called home?
Well, the people we'd been speaking to told us that they were very fearful, that they had fled their homes because they felt they had no choice. They did not believe statements by Azerbaijani authorities that they would be able to integrate into Azerbaijani society as part, when Nagorno-Karabakh has become part of that. Again, it is inside its internationally recognized borders, but has been kind of a separate entity for 3 decades. And people said they did not want to live under Azerbaijan. They were very fearful about that. They were fearful for their safety. They'd also been living under a blockade for several months as well. And so they do not at all trust those reassurances from Azerbaijan. And so they simply said they had no choice. And it was a real wrench for a lot of the people we were talking about, leaving their homes, leaving the graves of loved ones that they'll say they'll never be able to see again. So this is something that a lot of people felt they had no choice to do out of fear.
And clearly people arriving there in Goris, where you are, they've had this long journey. Psychologically, it's been a pretty traumatic time for them, not least because they lived under blockade for 10 months. What sort of state are people in when they arrive there in Goris?
Well, you can imagine the kind of exhaustion and, yes, psychological trauma of a lot of the people. We've seen people very shaken up, very despondent, a lot of them very hungry, saying they hadn't had enough food for several years. Some of them barely had enough fuel to make it across the border. Their vehicles packed down on the roads because there'd been that blockade on basic supplies. Other people very injured, that fuel depot explosion. So people with severe burns, some of the people who were ill actually died after getting into Armenia. So there's a real state of distress for a lot of the people. There's children here wondering how their futures are going to look like, entire families living in uncertainty. So it is going to be a huge challenge for them adapting to this new life inside Armenia.
And Catherine, this is my last question to you before we cross to our guests. I mean, has the exodus now ended? And just tell us what happens next for the refugees in places like Goris, where you are.
Yeah, the exodus has ended for now. There are said to be a few hundred people still inside Nagorno-Karabakh, but people perhaps with disabilities or elderly or isolated people who weren't able to get out. But apart from that, no, there are no more people on the roads. The exodus has ended. And basically, people are heading elsewhere in Armenia to see where they can shelter and where they can go. And that's going to be a huge challenge for Armenia going forward, with suddenly this massive influx of people looking for somewhere not only to stay in the short term, but somewhere to live and to get work. And there's also, a great deal of anger from a lot of these Karabakh Armenians towards Armenian authorities about how this could have been allowed to happen.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed for bringing us all the latest there from the southern Armenian border town of Goris. Catherine Norris-Trent, our senior reporter, thank you very much indeed. Let's turn now to our guests. Let me start with you, Laurent Leylakian. You're here with us in the studio. Just picking up on some of the things that Catherine was telling us there, people have obviously left Nagorno-Karabakh in very large numbers. What about the people that stay behind? What's going to happen to them?
Well, as it has been said, there are probably very few left people behind. Some of them have been arrested, especially the officials have been arrested. For instance, the former president, Araik Harutyunyan, or some others have been arrested and brought to Baku, where they joined the former prisoner of war dating from 2020, from the war in 2020, and which has not been released in full violation of the agreement. And for the other ones, probably, as it has been said by the UN mission, whatever dubious could have been this UN mission, and I'm very cautious with the UN mission. They said there could be 50 to 100 or 1,000 people. They don't know exactly, and probably Azerbaijan will show them up. As in the kind of Potemkin village, showing that everything is fine for them. But as it has been said by Catherine, there are only left some disabled or old people, and I saw some propaganda film showing that they are well treated, that there are some doctors came to examine them, and so on and so forth. So it will be a kind of a show for the Azerbaijani regime.
Let's go to Yerevan and ask Richard Giragosian. Richard, is there a feeling there in Armenia that there was simply no choice for these people? They had to leave, or did people feel they perhaps could have stayed if they wanted to?
Well, I think there was a clear feeling of insecurity, a pronounced perception that continuing to stay in Nagorno-Karabakh was no longer feasible. It's also important to remember this comes after 10 months of a medieval-style siege. Shortages of food, critical medicine, gasoline, which also meant no ambulances or fire service. Azerbaijan basically created a situation where daily life was no longer tolerable, and the mass exodus of Armenians met a key objective of the Azerbaijani authorities.
Thanks. Let's get perspective now from Baku. Last but not least in our guests lineup this evening, Professor Kavus Abushov. I just want to ask you, what's the reaction there in Baku, in Azerbaijan, to the fact that almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody, has decided to leave Nagorno-Karabakh, despite assurances from the authorities?
Thanks. The reaction and the mood is very clear. So there's a feeling of regret that a lot of Armenians are leaving in mass. There's also some understanding. So I partly agree with Richard's comments that a lot of people, some people are leaving for security reasons because there's been a war. In 2020, there was a mass full-scale war between Armenia and Azerbaijan. However, I would classify the people leaving Nagorno-Karabakh into two groups: those who don't accept to live as a part of Azerbaijan, and those who are leaving for security purposes or for security reasons. So what is good, what I feel good a little bit, is that I see a lot of positive hope in Azerbaijan, for particularly at the official level, but also at the societal level, that Nagorno-Karabakh Armenians are going to return and coexist with the Azerbaijanis. And I've also been, I find it positive or good that the Azerbaijani government has gradually or slowly been in the process of developing a blueprint for the coexistence of Armenians and the Azerbaijanis. That's at least my hope.
Yeah, and I just want to pick up on that because, we forget, in fact, that there were Azeris, or Azerbaijanis, as they're also called, living in Nagorno-Karabakh. And just staying with you, Professor Abushov, I mean, did the two communities live side by side in harmony in that enclave, as far as you understand?
Absolutely, absolutely. Any conflict in history, and there's a lot of research on that, is caused by elite entrepreneurship, elite manipulation. There was nationalism, and nationalism has brought up this conflict. Before if you look at 1970s, 80s, etc., Armenians and Azeris had coexisted peacefully, both in Nagorno-Karabakh and in other parts of Azerbaijan and within Armenia as well. Yes, it was coincidentally that nationalism inflamed and it brought about these results. So therefore, I'm confident that with time, certain ethnic Armenians will be returning to Nagorno-Karabakh to coexist with the Azerbaijanis. And as the presidential advisor of Azerbaijan, Hikmet Hacıyev, he announced that Azerbaijan sees the coexistence in the form of cultural, religious, and other rights of ethnic Armenians in Nagorno-Karabakh and a joint municipality, etc. That reminds me of cultural autonomy in a way. The Azerbaijani government doesn't mention the term of cultural autonomy, but it's everything that is there.
OK, I want to pick up on 2 points you've made. Firstly, the idea that these two communities lived side by side in relative harmony in Nagorno-Karabakh previously. And secondly, the point that people will one day or might one day have the opportunity to return to Nagorno-Karabakh, even though they're currently in Armenia. Laurent, how likely do those 2 points sound to you?
Of course, I must disagree. Precisely, at the beginning of not the beginning, but the story in 1990s, the Armenians from the Soviet Republic of Azerbaijan were claiming nothing else and more than this cultural autonomy, and that's because they have been crushed. There have been some pogroms in the 1990s that, in the end, it turned into full-scale war, and they gained their independence. The attempt of erasing the Armenian population from Karabakh, and by the way, from Azerbaijan too, because as it has been said, there were some Armenians in Azerbaijan and there were some Azeris in nowadays Armenia, is a project dating back from the 20s and even from the beginning of the 20th century. It was the Pan-Turkish project to erase this Armenian population, to make a continuum of Turkish population all around. So I don't trust that Mr. Aliyev, which is in the line of this project, will grant some right to the Armenian population, as first is not granting any rights to its own citizen. It could happen if there is a new regime, because there are some opponents in Azerbaijan that are completely left alone by the West also, and they are, by the way, most of them are in exile or in jail. So if there is a new power in Azerbaijan, maybe it could happen, but with this regime, certainly not.
OK, Richard Giragosyan, can I ask you those same 2 questions? Do you think it's likely people will be able to return eventually? And secondly, is it true, in your opinion, that these 2 communities did live side by side up until quite recently?
I'm rather skeptical. If we look at the pattern and historical record of coexistence, it was too long ago. It was many decades ago. We've had a generation since, in Nagorno-Karabakh and now in Armenia, that experiences and enjoys a functioning democracy. And I do think that factor, the political, is underestimated, because in that context, the Armenians enjoying democratic liberty and freedom are not willing to surrender to subordination under a family dynasty or the authoritarian government of Azerbaijan. So I think realistically, both sides have to normalize relations, but I don't see any possibility for the Armenians to return to Nagorno-Karabakh under today's Azerbaijani dictatorship.
And since you're there in Yerevan, let me stay with you, Richard. And I just want to ask you about the visit of the French Foreign Minister, Catherine Colonna, the most senior Western official to visit Armenia in recent weeks. Why do you think she's there? And what do you think she can achieve during her visit?
Well, I think her visit alone was both significant and successful. It's an important demonstration of concern, not just from a French perspective, but also as a leader within the European Union. And I do think there is a demonstrable increase in Western engagement, including from the United States. This is also empowering Armenia to escape the orbit of Russian power and position. And I do think the real new challenge for Armenia is also the challenge of Russia as an unreliable so-called partner. Hence the importance of the French foreign minister's stress of the French reliability and commitment to Armenia, both as a democracy as well as a nation under threat. But I am still optimistic because Armenia is nothing if not a nation of survivors.
What is France's link to Armenia, Laurent? And why do you think France has decided it wants to take the lead, or at least it seems to be taking the lead so far in this situation?
Well, before replying to this question, let me hail the announcement made by Mrs. Colonna. Even before this move to Armenia, France was at the spearhead of the support to Armenia and Armenians in the region, with many positions, but it was verbal position. And now she took some strong position with apparently some concrete initiatives. So that's really, yes, outstanding. And it could be, as it has been said by Mr. Garagossian, a swing for Armenia. It could be the momentum for a swing from the Russian orbit to the West, if the West accept, of course. Now, the reason behind the interest of France is certainly a long-standing, I would say, love between French and Armenian. I would say Francophilia by Armenia, but that's not enough. There are some strong political reasons behind that, maybe to weaken or to take the lead in a region which is clearly dominated by Russia, but also to contain Turkey, because Turkey is the other, I would say, invisible player, and Turkey is more and more a threat, not only in Caucasus, but also in the Aegean Sea. And at least it is seen like this by most of the European leaders. So it could be a way to limit the Turkish ambition, because today it's Karabakh, tomorrow it could be it's Karabakh through the Azerbaijan proxy. Tomorrow it could be an island, in a Greek island in the Mediterranean Sea. So it could be a way to make some clear signal to Turkey.
Turning to Baku, to Kavus Abushov, our professor there, what's the feeling there about where Russia was these last couple of months? Is there a sense that Russia's just too busy with other things to be able to in any way intervene in this situation, and therefore perhaps this presented the opportunity to the powers that be in Azerbaijan that now is the time to take back control of Nagorno-Karabakh?
I mean, on the one hand, Russia has been busy in Ukraine. That is the feeling. On the other hand, however, there has been discontent in Azerbaijan with the implementation of the tripartite agreement, in particular demilitarization of Nagorno-Karabakh. And the primary reason why Azerbaijani police forces and the army went into Nagorno-Karabakh itself was because there had not been any serious progress in the demilitarization. People were dying in Azerbaijan in the landmines laid in Nagorno-Karabakh and outside Nagorno-Karabakh as well. So the reason why the timing is, yes, I agree with you, because Russia's been busy, but also because Azerbaijan was not completely satisfied with the implementation of the tripartite agreement.
Richard, your opinions on Russia. Where was Russia all the while? And why didn't Russia, this traditional ally of Armenia, have Armenia's back in its hour of need?
That there was an interesting paradox. On the one hand, there's a degree of Russian complicity in this recent operation, largely among senior leaders in both Moscow and Baku, where Azerbaijan was emboldened, both by Turkish support, but also by Russian coordination, complicity. But the paradox is unique because in addition to that senior level leadership complicity, Russian force on the ground was embarrassingly humiliated by Azerbaijan. The Russian peacekeepers and Russia itself could not even enforce the terms of the 2020 ceasefire that Russia imposed. So there was an interesting contradiction here. But I do think the broader precedent is extremely concerning. and it goes beyond Russia or even Azerbaijan. It's the precedent where recent action by the Azerbaijani armed forces tends to dangerously validate the use of force over diplomacy. This is why and where it directly affects France and European values.
Yeah, and where do you think Azerbaijan's ambitions lie, therefore, after Nagorno-Karabakh, Laurent? Do you think, as a number of our commentators have said in recent days, that Baku is thinking perhaps that was quite easy, what are we going to do next?
I don't know. Ilham Aliyev himself said recently that he will respect the territorial integrity of Armenia. But I don't know if we could believe this pledge, because he said beforehand that he will respect the ceasefire agreement. And so we can be quite dubious. On the other hand, Mrs. Colonna said that she will push the United Nations to vote a resolution, the Council of Security, for the deployment of some blue helmets or security force, international security forces in Karabakh. That's great, but I don't know how she will manage. I mean, how the international community will manage to do so, because it means probably a direct confrontation with Azerbaijan. Nowadays, the Azerbaijan soldiers are in Karabakh, so it could be it would be a problem. To come back to Russia, we are certainly in a situation where, as it has been said, Russia is now very weakened by the Ukrainian conflict. Here again, as it has been humiliated also by Azerbaijan, and they are in a withdrawal position. But as it was the case after the Soviet Revolution, Russia left for 2 years and they came back stronger than ever. So we should not forget this factor.
Sure, and let's get opinion from Baku, from Professor Aboushov. Do you think there's a sense there in Azerbaijan that the country has an appetite for further territorial expansion? Is that something you hear people talking about? Is that something you're hearing people rearing for in Baku?
This country has suffered from aggression by a neighboring country. It had 1 million IDPs, refugees, and at times when everybody was saying, the UN Security Council resolutions, the Council of Europe resolutions were saying, Armenia needs to stop its aggression. Armenia needs to allow the repatriation of IDPs. So we were not talking about democracy at all. So I don't think so. I mean, there's no need for territorial appetite. I mean, use of force, we talked about use of force and so on and forth. Yes, that was all legal within the territory of Azerbaijan, both in 2020. And 2020 war was actually in those regions outside Nagorno-Karabakh. So Armenia was fighting Armenian soldiers in Azerbaijan's territory in 2020. A country that has suffered from so much aggression, and what I hear in the Azerbaijani society amongst the IDPs, and a lot of IDPs, I have a lot of students who are from IDP families. They feel sorry for the sufferings, for the feelings, for the processes the Karabakh Armenians are going through. They say they suffered in the 1990s. They were subject to a massacre, a genocide, 1992. They don't want anybody else to suffer. I think it is high time that we put a point to nationalism, and we start with a pragmatic approach to peace building and reconciliation between Armenia and Azerbaijan as states, and within Karabakh between Azerbaijan and Armenian communities.
So would you say, Professor Aboushov, that everyone agrees with what's been done with regards to Nagorno-Karabakh there in Baku? Would the average person say, our country's done exactly the right thing, we had no choice?
I think so. I think most people in Azerbaijan, as well as in the diaspora, they say there was a lot of Azerbaijani people. Don't forget the past, please. A lot of Azerbaijani people have longed for a right of return to Khankenti, to Stepanakert. Yes, a right of return to those regions. So it's a mixed feeling of anger and at the same time also hope for coexistence. But the mood here, back to your question, is that there was no other option left by the opposite side.
Okay, what's the opinion from Yerevan, Richard? I mean, is there a feeling that diplomatic cards could have been played rather differently? All of this could have been avoided, a deal could have been struck, and that perhaps the Prime Minister made mistakes?
Well, there's a sense of anger, frustration, and raw emotion in Armenia. However, this is quite natural and normal. I do think the deeper frustration is Armenia's solitude. Armenia has very much been left alone by everyone, abandoned, betrayed by Russia, clearly. But at the same time, there's a deeper concern. And that concern is the military victory by Azerbaijan also undermines faith and confidence in democracy. And this is a deeper problem, something we also have to address. But going forward, I think the only way forward is a return to diplomacy by all sides.
Yeah, and just looking at the relationship between Yerevan and Moscow, there was a new development today, which was that Armenian lawmakers voted in favor of joining the International Criminal Court. Now, that's something that's angered the Kremlin, because it would mean that longtime ally Yerevan would be obligated to respect the ICC's international arrest warrants, including the one if it's issued for Vladimir Putin. France 24's Camille Nedelec has this report for us.
A domestic decision with international significance. Armenian lawmakers voted to ratify the Rome Statute on Tuesday, the first step to joining the International Criminal Court. It's the latest strain on ties between Yerevan and Moscow. In March, the ICC issued an arrest warrant for Russian President Vladimir Putin, meaning if he steps foot on Armenian soil, Yerevan would have to comply with ICC rules.
We have doubted from the very beginning that from the point of view of bilateral relations, Armenia's accession to the Rome Statute of the ICC is not correct. We still believe that this is the wrong decision.
After the 2020 war between Armenia and Azerbaijan over the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh, some 2,000 Russian peacekeeping troops were deployed to the Lachin Corridor, the single road link out of the territory to Armenia. It was under their watch that Baku launched its lightning military operation last month. Amid fears that an emboldened Azerbaijan could encroach further, Armenia is increasingly turning to the West for protection and insists that the decision to join the ICC has nothing to do with Russia. While France was quick to welcome Armenia's decision, any EU support could be hampered by its move away from Russian gas over the war in Ukraine. The bloc agreed last year to double its imports of Azerbaijani gas by 2027, an energy source it could be loath to give up.
OK, Laurent, you were looking at that report with me here in the studio. Clearly, what Yerevan has done, recognising, ratifying the Rome Statute, a step towards joining the ICC, that's angered the Kremlin. The Kremlin's expressed irritation today. Sure. Why do you think it's done this then?
Well, I don't think at all that it was directed toward Russia. Certainly not. It was clearly in connection with the aggression of Azerbaijan on Artsakh, on Karabakh, but also on Armenia itself. You know that Azerbaijan is occupying nowadays around 150 square kilometers in Armenia, and the aggression on Artsakh have been also accompanied by many war crimes and execution of civilians and so on and so forth. So clearly, the target is Azerbaijan and certainly not Russia. Now, Russia being an authoritarian state, it could only trigger some mistrust from Russia. And that for sure, once again, it could be, it's a clear sign that Armenia is clearly bending toward more and more clearly bending toward the West. And if I may, recently, as Mrs. Colonna went in Armenia, and she announced many measures. Recently in France, there have been an NGO, the Coordination for the Defense of Eastern Christian, that announced that it filed a suit against against Mr. Aliyev and its family, its clan, toward the ICC prosecutor. And France could support this idea also, but it could be also the sign of support from France to Armenia.
Richard, what are your thoughts? I mean, does this symbolize, is this the death knell, would you say, in the relationship between Yerevan and Moscow? Or would you agree with what Laurent said, that this is just a coincidence? It's got nothing to do with relations with Russia?
Well, interestingly, it's a little of both. On the one hand, the ICC ratification is yet another move by Armenia to strengthen its sovereignty and independence. In other words, despite Russia. At the same time, one example would be the United States does not ratify the ICC. That doesn't make the U.S. pro-Russian. And Armenian ratification does not make Armenia automatically anti-Putin. For the Armenian priority, it's more about Azerbaijan. But I would add, however, there is an interesting side effect, a plus, if you will, a message to Moscow. And in this context, the ICC ratification is not new nor a surprise. It's the latest in a steady series of moves by Armenia away from Russia.
Okay, that's Russia. There is another regional player we haven't actually mentioned yet, which is Iran. And I'd like to ask our friend in Baku, Professor Aboushov, who do you think is Iran's friend in all of this? Do you think Iran is closer to Baku or closer to Yerevan or closer to neither? And does it matter?
Iran, thank you. Iran is very much driven by its own interests, but it seems for structural reasons, and the structural reasons are there's a large number of ethnic Azeris in Iran. Actually, Iran is run by ethnic Azeris. And the existence of an independent Azerbaijan has always been seen with mistrust, perceived mistrust in Iran. For that reason, since the end of 2020 war, there's been a lot of tension between Iran and Azerbaijan, and Iran has seemingly not been satisfied with the result of the 2020 war. That's why it's obviously closer to Armenia than Azerbaijan.
What are your thoughts?
Iran also sees Azerbaijan to be an ally of Israel and Turkey and the West, and that deepens its mistrust towards Baku.
Laurent, your thoughts? I mean, where is Iran in this, and why does it matter? Because, of course, it does have a border, doesn't it, with Armenia?
Yeah, this time I would agree mostly with Mr. Aboushov. Yes, for Iran, the statu quo is probably the best solution, because Iran is afraid to be surrounded by Turkish or Azeri-Turkish population and Azeri-Turkish powers. It's once again, it's an old pan-Turkish project to surround Iran, and also maybe with some irredentist threat on northern Iran, which is actually populated, as it has been said, by many Azeri Turks. And to be clear, even the name of Azerbaijan has been picked up as a kind of the initial Azerbaijan, the geographical Azerbaijan is south of Arax River. So in Iran, what we call nowadays the Republic of Azerbaijan was never named like this up to 1920. It was named the Caspian Plain, or the Shirvan or Aran, but not Azerbaijan. So the very fact that Azerbaijan, when it started up, which is appear in the history as a state, pick up this name, is revealing its ambition. This ambition has been first pushed forward by the pan-Turkists of Turkey, and then by the Bolshevik for the very same reason, to grab some territories from Iran. So I understand that Iran could fear this threat, and also, as Mr. Aboushov has said, the fact that Azerbaijan is a kind of backyard for Israel for spying operation over Iran.
Richard, your thoughts on this issue of Iran before we move on? Because, of course, the topic of today's discussion is about who can Armenia count on. And I just want to get your perspective. Is Iran one of the countries that could play a role that would be advantageous to Armenia?
Well, Iran has already demonstrated that it's an important outlet for Armenia, as well as an alternative source of natural gas to overcome our dependence on Russia. But I do think, from an Armenian perspective, we're a prisoner of geography, and no country gets to choose its neighbors. However, I do think Iran has not yet returned to its traditional role as a regional actor. Today, the South Caucasus is very much a contest between and also among Russia and Turkey more than Iran. But there are two red lines for Iran. One is Armenia's borders, where Iran doesn't want to lose Armenia as a stable, friendly neighbor, especially given Iraq and Afghanistan as the alternatives. Secondly, we also see a significant spike in tension between Azerbaijan and Iran that has nothing to do with Armenia. It's about the return of Israeli leader Benjamin Netanyahu. It's about the Israeli-Azerbaijani relationship. And that actually bears scrutiny and something to watch.
Yeah, maybe just another element to know. In the wake of the venue of Mrs. Colonna in Armenia, there has been a meeting today or yesterday, I don't know exactly, between the ambassador of France in Armenia and the ambassador of Iran in Armenia. So I don't know what they said, but the very fact that they meet is an element to consider in our global thought on this issue.
Okay, and just last, I mean, there is this theory out there, and it's a little bit of a left field theory. Some suspicion, I've been told, in Yerevan that perhaps people in Europe are relieved in a way that this issue of Nagorno-Karabakh has been resolved, at least in one sense, because it gives Russia less bargaining power and gives Yerevan less dependence on Moscow. Let me ask you, Richard Giragosyan, what do you make of that theory?
Well, I'm not prone to conspiracy theories, and in this particular case, I would reject the premise because it is actually a threat to European values. The way Nagorno-Karabakh was purportedly resolved, in other words, might makes right in this context, is a direct challenge to Western values at a time where Russia's failed invasion of Ukraine makes it even more imperative to defend democracy.
Okay, you've had the last word. Richard Giragosyan, director of the independent think tank, the Regional Studies Centre. Thank you very much indeed to you. Thank you to our guest in the studio, Laurent Lelekian, political analyst and Asia Minor specialist. And from Baku, a very big thank you to Professor Kavus Abushoff at Ada University. Thank you so much to you as well. That was today's France 24 debate.